We have heard that creation continues to groan in bondage, waiting for its liberation. We are challenged by the cries of all of God's creatures who suffer and by the woundedness of creation itself. We live in a scandalous world that denies God's call to life for all. The policy of unlimited growth among industrialized countries and the drive for profit have plundered the earth and severely damaged the environment. In 1989, one species disappeared every day, and by 2000 it was one every hour. Climate change, the depletion of fish stocks, deforestation, soil erosion, and threats to fresh water are among the devastating consequences. We recognize the enormity and complexity of the situation. We do not seek simple answers. As seekers of truth and justice, and looking through the eyes of powerless and suffering people and animals, we see that the current world disorder is rooted in an extremely complex and immoral economic system defended by empire.
I was raised in the Catholic tradition, and in that tradition we have a lot of saints. And what I came to understand as I more and more worshiped with people of the various Protestant traditions is saints don't have such a high profile, with the exception of St. Francis of Assisi, who is regularly celebrated and who we're celebrating today. I have to say, if there's one saint I would choose, it would be St. Francis. I think he is very possibly the greatest saint of the Western tradition. He is, of course, the patron of animals, which is why we have other creatures in the sanctuary today. I, frankly, would love to have them in the sanctuary every Sunday. He's also the patron saint of the environment. And more than that, he exemplified an enormously simple lifestyle, which also today for us connects very closely to the environment and to climate change. Please pray with me. O God, enlarge within us the sense of fellowship with all living things, our brothers and sisters, the animals, to whom you gave the earth as their home in common with us. We remember with shame that in the past we have exercised the high dominion of humans with ruthless cruelty, so that the voice of the earth, which should have gone up to you in song, has been a groan of suffering. May we realize that all creatures live not for us, but for themselves and for you, and that they love the sweetness of life. That was written by St. Basil in the 4th century. It has long been a concern in the Christian tradition that we humans have something of a disordered relationship with creation. In 1989, I made a big career change. I had been working as a chemical engineer, and I decided that I wanted to go to graduate school and become a research psychologist. And so I had a little time between quitting my job and starting graduate school, and I had a little bit of money. So I decided to see the world. And for me, that looked like going to India and spending a month in an ashram. We landed in Mumbai before dawn. Actually, it was pretty close to the middle of the night. And so I didn't see much of anything until the sun came up, and by that time we were in a bus headed north outside of Mumbai. And I saw some disturbing things for me, the housing that I saw, the little shacks, the people sleeping by the side of the road. But I had no direct contact with the people of India until we arrived at the ashram. And I got off of the bus, and there were folks milling around from the local town. This was mostly a rural area, but there was a very small village in walking distance of the ashram. And my first impression of these people was of how very, very thin they were. We North Americans tend to have quite a bit of meat on our bones. And my second impression was that the walls around the ashram were surprisingly high, And when I looked up, what I could see are coils of razor wire on top of those walls. I really didn't know how to hold that. I mean, this is basically a monastery, right? The gates of the ashram opened and some folks came out. They were also Indian, but they had a lot more meat on their bones. And I had my first experience of seeing the haves and the have-nots next to each other, and you could see it in their bodies. I quickly came to understand why the high walls and the razor wire. What was inside the ashram versus outside was pretty stark. Inside we had a water treatment facility so that when we turned on the spigots, we could drink the water and not get sick. We had very high quality food, which meant it most certainly was not local food. It was probably brought in from Mumbai. We had a sewer system, which certainly did not exist in the local village, with our own private leach field, and that meant when we flushed the toilets, which were squat toilets, but when we flushed the toilets, we actually, had modern sewage treatment happening. And we had really good accommodations, very, very primitive by Western standards, but far better than the little houses in the village near us. Now, this was my first experience in a developing nation. I know some of you here have served in the Peace Corps and have had probably similar experiences. But for me, it was the first. And when I left India, I still did not understand why such a difference. I had a vague understanding that there were very complex economic and social and historical issues. But in fact, what was already going on in 1989 is that the cycles of production and consumption, driven by the very large appetites of the industrialized world, were already starting to add to a large underclass on this planet. And what's happened since then with global warming, again a result of these cycles of consumption and production, is that that very growing underclass is holding most of the burden of climate change. And that's why climate change is, in fact, the largest social justice issue of our time and worth talking about on Sunday. So when I came back from India, I went to work at NASA, and there was climate change research going on in those years. It wasn't entirely clear, but it got clear really, really fast, which is why it's still rather frustrating to hear some of the dialogue that goes on in our politics and in our culture wars. The data were well collected, the methodologies were good, the stuff was published in world-class journals that were peer-reviewed. I mean, come on. And it's very, very clear. Our planet is heating up, and it's heating up because of the greenhouse gases, because we burn a lot of fossil fuel, and the reason we burn a lot of fossil fuel is we consume tremendous amounts of goods in the industrialized world. It is not, and again the data is clear on this, it is not because we have more people on the planet. It's not because those folks over there are having lots of babies. The people I saw in India were not the ones consuming all the goods, I can assure you. And so it's about us. It's about the industrialized world. And that gets really hard. It gets really hard. We have a very, very clear and straight connection to what's happening with climate change. And let me talk a bit about this equation of production and consumption. A lot of what we do, and I know there are people in this room who really do think and act a lot on this issue, but what we mostly tend to do is on the production side of that equation. So we buy a Prius instead of an SUV, and we've got a whole parking lot full of them. We choose to recycle, for instance, but nothing is going to move really substantially in terms of turning around climate change without addressing the consumption side of that equation. And that means really big lifestyle changes. You know, that stuff gets really hard. I know I go in and out of denial about it on a regular basis. I live a fairly simple life by the standards around us today, But the fact is, the lifestyle I live, probably in order to be brought into some kind of order and balance with the planet, needs to be a heck of a lot simpler. That's really tough. That level of change is really hard. And the thing about this consumption stuff is it's a lot of decisions that we have to make on a daily basis. It's not just one big decision. And that's tough. It means we have to continue to stay conscious and think about, do we need or do we want that thing that we're going to buy? Something that's gotten really clear to me in the last years is that when I want to buy anything at all, a pack of gum or a car, that it is no longer a personal financial decision, that it is in fact a moral choice and it affects the planet. And so for me, that's tough. I go into the grocery store. You want to talk about having to make a dozen good decisions in the space of a half hour. You know, I look over at the produce, love those asparagus from South America, and veggies are good for me, right? But, you know, there's local produce too. It seems like a little decision, but what will shift this equation are lifestyle changes, and that is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of those little decisions. And then I go into the packaged food aisles. Oh my goodness. We won't even talk about the nutritional issues that might exist in those aisles. The amount of energy to process those foods and to create the packaging, and then we take it home, and what do we do with the packaging? The carbon footprint on that stuff is amazingly large. And there's the meat counter. Now, I don't eat red meat. I actually came to understand, though, some things about it recently that maybe you guys know, but actually surprised me. We have a large appetite for the meat from cows and pigs, and so we have way, way, way more cows and pigs on the planet than would be natural. And they create methane, and methane is a greenhouse gas. And it turns out that is a huge contribution to the greenhouse gases, a really significant amount. And of course, if we've driven down I-5 past the feedlots, we have a first-hand experience of what is meant by large volumes of methane. So it's really tough. I mean, these are the daily kinds of decisions. And most of what I've talked about is still really on that production side, right? It's just making better choices, but we're still buying. The consumption side gets even harder. That's about not buying at all. That is really about looking at what we need, which I know for myself is far less than what I want and therefore buy, and I have the money, and why shouldn't I? So it gets tough. It's kind of a life against nature. It is a life against the marketing machine that drives the consumerism. And that is a powerful machine. I have marketing experience. I know how those messages are created, and they still get to me. They're everywhere. We swim in that water of that marketing pressure. And so when we make a decision, it is a decision that is over against empire. It is a decision of resistance. It is a decision, one could say, of subversion. And they're hard to make. Those kind of decisions are always hard to make. St. Francis offers us a really good model. He demonstrated an enormously simple lifestyle. He, I think, did not directly relate it in the way it's clear it is related for us today in terms of damage to the environment. Although in his time, what was actually going on, which is interesting, I think, the large cities of Italy, not far from Assisi, what was emerging there was the beginning of what has become our modern banking system. And he was certainly well aware of that. And so what he was acting over against was something very much connected to what we would have to act against. His model of simple living, of course, comes straight out of the Gospels. We have a powerful tradition in Christianity of simple living. We all know the passages. What St. Francis did was this really radical thing, though. He opened those Gospels, and he was not a great theologian. He was actually rather minimally educated. And he just took them at face value. Didn't say, oh, he couldn't really have meant that, or, oh, this was about the time and the place. And he saw that it said, sell all you have and give to the poor. And he turned to his brothers and said, well, I guess that's what we're going to do. It was radical in his time, and he annoyed a lot of people. Of course, Jesus was radical and also annoyed a lot of people. These are movements against empire, pushing against the popular culture. And when we do that, there are consequences, by the way. Our economy is built on ever-accelerating consumption. And if we break that equation, if we stop consuming, there will be consequences. Of course, if we don't, the planet will die. So really, we've reached a stage where we're talking about balancing the bad against the, final destruction of the environment. It's a tough thing to hold. I like to think I'm not that closely associated to such a very large social justice issue. And aside from what we choose to do individually, by the way, as a faith community, we have some options. There's something called a Green Church movement. I don't know, have any of you guys heard of this? It is about communities coming together and looking very closely at how we worship, how we use the worship space, and being very thoughtful about changes that could be made. Now, I know we have done some of this here, and I want to acknowledge that. We use real cups, not paper cups, and put them in the dishwasher. That's a big step. Most churches don't, right, because of the convenience. All those Priuses in the parking lot. But there's probably a great deal more that could be done. And in order to become Green Church certified, it's actually a fairly rigorous process. And it does include things that we do in worship. Here's where I think I'll annoy all of you. Any pastor will tell you, by the way, to change a big thing in worship is the sure way to cause a riot in your congregation. But I'm going to talk about our relationship to paper anyway. I was a chemical engineer, and so I actually know how this stuff is made. It's one of the nastiest processes. It's called a crafting process. Uses horrible chemicals, uses lots of energy, and lots of water, by the way. Nobody graduating from my class wanted to go make paper for a living. We knew better. It's better if we recycle. That's still on that production side of the equation, and recycled paper takes only about 40% of the energy of, new paper. And that's good, but the real way to make an impact is don't use paper. Don't buy it. That's the consumption side of the equation. And for us, it turns out there are options, and there are technology options. Technology isn't always our friend in this, by the way. It actually takes some really thoughtful consideration. But in this case, a little refurbished computer hooked up to a projector is far, far less impactful to the planet than month after month and year after year of paper. But it's a big change. And we're really sensitive to changes in worship. I can remember even as a little girl when they started singing the Mass in English, I wasn't sure I was a Catholic anymore. I mean, seriously, this stuff runs really deep. It's not just about one or two cranky people in a congregation. And so it's a big change. We're asked to make those changes as a community just as we're asked to make it as individuals. I want to close today with a passage from the encyclical of Pope Francis. Has any of you read the encyclical or read parts of it? It's a fabulous document. Really tough language. A landmark document. There's some theology in there I don't agree with, but by and large it's great. And this is a passage from the opening pages of that encyclical. God has written a precious book whose letters are the multitude of created things present in the universe. Every act of cruelty towards any creature is contrary to human dignity. We can hardly consider ourselves to be fully loving if we disregard any aspect of reality. I'll say that again. We can hardly consider ourselves to be fully loving if we disregard any aspect of reality. Peace, justice, and the preservation of creation are three absolutely interconnected themes which cannot be separated and treated individually. Amen.
God bless the grass that's gentle and low. Its roots, they are deep, and its will is to grow. God bless the truth, the friend of the poor, and the wild grass growing at the poor man's door. And God bless the grass, and God bless the grass.